good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share a little bit about my research that I've been carrying out for the last 6 years almost. And in this talk today, I'm trying to shed some light on not so much who are the people smugglers, but rather I will be asking who are the people that go to jail for people smuggling offenses. And you can imagine that this question is quite different, or the answer to the question is quite different that you might expect. And the answers might also not particularly conform to the ever-present stereotypes of the evil and greedy smugglers that we all know from the media. So, what am I going to do? First of all, I'm going to show you some results of a survey that I did a year and a half ago that gives you some ideas of convictions of people smuggling in Indonesia. And after that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is being done in Indonesia in terms of preventing people smuggling, and I'm going to talk about so-called anti-people smuggling information campaigns. However, as you will see, these campaigns were not particularly successful, and the reason for that, as you will see in the third part of the presentation, is poverty and environmental disasters in certain parts of Indonesia where it has been particularly easy to recruit fishermen to become the transporters in these people smuggling encounters. However, let's start with some rather basic information on asylum seeker movements between Indonesia and Australia. As you can see on this map, Indonesia is a transiting country. It sees quite a variety of asylum seekers coming to Indonesia, particularly from the Middle East. So we have Iran, Iraq, but also other countries from South Asia. For example, Sri Lanka has been the country of origin, sending along a number of asylum seekers. So depending on where these people are from, we will see different modi of how people enter Indonesia. Some arrive on direct flights, enter with, let's say, tourist visa. Others will have to transit at a number of different points, Thailand, Malaysia, and then cross into Indonesia by boat. So the interesting part here is that in the past, people would then usually get onto boats to Australia from Indonesia. This, at the time being, has stopped. As you can see, between 2009 and 2013, more than 50,000 asylum seekers made their way to Australia by boat from Indonesia, and they did so with the help of Indonesian transporters. So these numbers are actually quite small if we compare them to the arrivals of maritime asylum seekers, for example, who are coming to Italy. We'll see that 50,000 people, this is a number that Italy sees sometimes in 2 months or even less. However, the arrival of these maritime asylum seekers in Australia has not only triggered a hyper-politicized debate on migration, but also refugee protection and national security, but it has, of course, also led to the adoption of a number of restrictive asylum seeker policies and deterrence strategies by successive Australian governments. Here you can see the archipelago of Indonesia, 17,000 islands, so that probably gives an idea how difficult border protection is in this place. It's very hard to control who comes in, who leaves. The coastline is more than 80,000 kilometers, so that's twice around the equator. At this map, we can see the most popular points of departure. So, in the early 2000s, Ashmore Reef, which is really just a couple of tiny islands that belongs to Australia, was a very frequently used spot. People would leave from the eastern part of Indonesia, such as Kupang or Timor. The people in front will be able to see it. It was just a trip that took about a day and a night to take the asylum seekers to these little reefs and then basically hand them over to the Australian authorities. At some point, when border surveillance increased, people stopped going through Ashmore Reef, and then a new route came into being, which is Christmas Island, which is also part of Australia. It takes a lot longer to get to Christmas Island. It's 2 days, 2 nights, and people have to cross the open waters, so it's a lot more dangerous to bring people to this place. In 2009, Australia opened a processing center in Christmas Island, and that in a way became attractive to people smugglers that were directly catering to this place. Okay, so I promised you to show you a couple of stats on who are the people who have been arrested and prosecuted and convicted in Indonesia. And just as background information, so this data set that I was able to compile consists of 99 people smuggling trials in Indonesia that were held between 2011 and 2015. The study looks most of all at the socio-economic profiles of the offenders, and it pays attention to age, gender, citizenship, origin, religion, previous employment, and so on and so on. The data was collected at Indonesian courts, so it required a lot of time traveling around to get this information. And as you will see, the places where I collected the data for the survey are pretty much the same as the places where boats depart from. Okay, so what were the results according to this survey? You can see that the number of convictions back in 2011 was very small, only 5 cases. And the reason for this is until 2011, people smuggling was not considered a crime in Indonesia. So even though people had been transporting asylum seekers from Indonesia to Australia, there was no way that they would go to jail in Indonesia. Lots of Indonesian transporters who helped out with this transport, however, ended up in Australian jails. The highest numbers of convictions were in 2012 and 2013, and this is basically for 2 reasons. So at this point, the collaboration between Indonesian and Australian law enforcement worked best. In 2013, it was revealed that the Australian government had been spying on the telephone of the Indonesian president, and that very much caused for the suspension of collaboration between Indonesian and Australian anti-people smuggling law enforcement. However, it's also the highest numbers migrating between Indonesia and Australia actually happened in 2012 and 2013. So it's not too surprising that the more people were passing through Indonesia, the more arrests we saw. However, nowadays numbers have decreased. This is also because Australia has introduced a set of new policies. It's usually referred to as Operation Sovereign Borders. So for the very first time, we see that Australian Custom and Navy officials are actually turning back boats to Indonesia, not just Indonesia, but also Vietnam and Sri Lanka. And that has become quite a disincentive for the people smuggling networks. Okay, so let's take a look at who are the people who are prosecuted for people smuggling. So in terms of age, we see that most of those people are actually in their low 20s and up to like early 40s. Which is kind of surprising because the minimum sentence in Indonesia and also in Australia is that people go to jail for 5 years. So people in their 20s to 40s are usually people who have a family, they are the backbones in providing an income for the family. So taking up a high risk where they know that they will be ending up in jail for 5 years, in a way for me was surprising to see. In terms of religion, we see that 88% of the convicted people smugglers said they were Muslim. The remainder was either Protestant or Catholic Christians. If you look at the average distribution of religion in Indonesia, this is nothing surprising because Indonesia is the country with the largest Muslim majority worldwide. Okay, next chart. This gives an idea of where people are actually coming from in Indonesia. So only a very small percentage, 8 people in fact, or 8 cases where people smugglers got arrested were non-Indonesians. The rest was all from Indonesia. So that doesn't really fit with the image that is around in Indonesia and Australia, which usually depicts Afghan or Pakistani or Sri Lankan people. So the majority of people who is convicted are actually from Indonesia. And according to this chart, you will see different provinces where these people are from. The important point here is to see that it's, of course, the provinces where all the points of departures are, but it also correlates with the provinces that are the poorest in Indonesia. Particularly the east of Indonesia is very underdeveloped, but I'm going to say a little bit more about this later on. Next chart is the former employment of convicted people smugglers. So the highest number of people, so when reading the court papers, were people who would say they're self-employed. In Indonesia, that's usually a bit of a euphemism because it means people don't have a stable job, so they're most likely unemployed. The second largest cohort was fishermen, and in a way that's a good connection to the previous talk that we heard on fishermen in Ghana who have become involved as facilitators for migrants from in Africa. So second largest number fishermen. We also see a number of military and police officers who have been involved in these people smuggling networks and that have gone to jail for their involvement. Very small numbers, farmers, bureaucrats, and drivers. And the last chart I'd like to show you is like the length of prison sentences in Indonesia, like what are the penalties that judges hand down. And I mentioned before that the minimum sentence is 5 years in Indonesia, maximum is 15 years. So as you can see, 60 months equals 5 years in prison. So the majority of people actually ends up in jail for 5 years. So what has been done to prevent Indonesian fishermen and other people to become involved in transporting asylum seekers? Between 2009 and 2013, there have been a number of public information campaigns that contain very strong anti-people smuggling messages, and these campaigns were distributed in ports and coastal villages within the Indonesian archipelago, mostly in the places that were used as departure points. The campaign in particular targeted fishermen, but also boat owners and builders, industrial workers and port authorities, ferry operators, and the local law enforcement officers in the key entry and exit points of the archipelago. And the aim of the campaign was to alert local fishermen to the dangers of accepting payments to become involved as captains or boat crews to carry asylum seekers to Australia. So there was a number of methods utilized. So a lot of material was distributed, stickers, cups, t-shirts, and they had very simple messages which would translate to, I know that people smuggling is wrong. So that was the main message that was sent out. Interestingly, these campaigns also sought to incorporate very strong religious dimensions. So depending on the targeted location, whether it was a Muslim or a Christian area, the campaign, which was funded by Australia, but carried out with the help of the International Organization for Migration, or IOM. So the organizers of the campaign, they recruited preachers and pastors in order to make a moral and theological case against people smuggling and irregular migration. And these religious leaders were basically encouraged to come and attend workshops and prepare sermons, both for Christian and Muslim communities. And then you can see on the left-hand side, there were small sermon books that were used on Sundays in church or Fridays in the mosque to read out these anti-people smuggling messages. And they used a lot of like biblical analogies or Quranic verses to explain why people smuggling is not just wrong, but is in fact sinful, and that's why fishermen should avoid it. So from the previous survey, it had become clear that a lot of fishermen are rather uneducated or only educated in a non-formal way. So the organizers of this campaign thought taking a religious pathway would provide them with more success. So just to give you an idea what these sermons were like, there is an excerpt from a Muslim sermon. Do you want me to read it out, or can you actually see it? Okay, maybe I just read the first part then. The blessed people of Allah, many among you are fishermen who work in the coastal industry. There has been news circulating recently of many irregular migrants trying to reach Australia through our borders, through this sea, through this area. The way they can reach Australia is by using our boats, our people, our knowledge. They ask for help, but blessed people of Allah, I tell you that this is not the help that is talked about in the Al-Quran. Bringing irregular migrants to Australia is illegal. It is a sin. If you agree to help house irregular migrants before they leave to Australia, if you have anything to do with smuggling these irregular migrants to Australia, it is a sin. You're not helping them. You're doing something wrong in the eyes of Allah. So, looking at these information that has been distributed in these coastal locations, we do actually find that there's very little explanation of who is an asylum seeker, why are they coming to Indonesia, what are they looking for. They're basically just disregarded as irregular migrants. So people in Indonesia, they would usually tend to help strangers in need for help. Indonesia is very much known for this sort of hospitality, but with these anti-people smuggling campaigns, there was basically a push using religious messages to prevent people from helping out. So have these campaigns been successful? Well, according to the organizers, there has been some success. Looking at the statistics, I say the success is rather doubtful, because even though these messages or these campaigns were being held since 2009, we actually have seen quite an increase of people being smuggled from Indonesia to Australia. What are the reasons for this? Well, I think the religious message that was handed out was not too convincing, because people thought about religious motivation only as secondary, but the reason for them to become involved in people smuggling networks was mostly for economic reasons: poverty, high rates of indebtedness, but also a lack of continuing their previous work in fishing. And after I had done this survey all over Indonesia, I decided to go to some of these places that had been used as departure points. So I decided to go to a small island, Rote. From this place, people had been carried over to Ashmore Reef. So, and I just wanted to get an impression, what is life like? Why is there such a high number of fishermen from Rote that are being recruited in these people smuggling networks as boat crew and captains? So, just to give you a very rough idea about the eastern part of Indonesia, compared to other regions in Indonesia, the eastern part is known for its lower incomes, higher poverty rates, and poor social indicators. So we have much higher infant mortality and lower life expectancy. Basically, people have referred to that part of Indonesia as the poorest areas all around Indonesia. The kind of poverty that we find there is often compared to African poverty, which sees a lot of people in rural areas rather than in cities, which is then classified as Asian poverty. Despite the vast natural resources, particularly in mining and forestry, the people of the region benefit rather little from the extraction of those resources. Overexploitation has not only caused irreparable environmental degradation, but competition for resources, which is often coupled with bad management and embezzlement, has often become a source for social conflict in this area. Eastern Indonesia has much more than other places suffered from conflicts. And I'd like to share a story with you about a guy who, I will refer to him as Amir for the time being. Amir was not put in jail in Indonesia, but he ended up in an Australian jail for people smuggling. He was a man in his early 50s from Rote. I got to meet him there. And at the time of when I visited this island, in one of the villages that I was staying, there were at least 50 people from the village that were currently serving a prison term either in Indonesia or in Australia for people smuggling. So it was quite a hot spot. Amir had transported asylum seekers twice to Australia, and he had also been imprisoned twice in Australia. He was paid $2,000 and for the first trip, and roughly $3,000 for the second trip. It turned out that what he said he had been paid for was actually not the sum that he had been promised, but he only got a down payment, and the actual money promised to him didn't come through. He acted as a captain on the boat, so his position was slightly better than that of usual boat crew members. Previously, he had been a fisherman, and he had been going out to some of the reefs to fish, but he said that in the last couple of years, the fish stock in these nearby reefs had terribly declined, while the costs for diesel, food, and equipment had gone up, and there was no way to make a living out of this. At the very first time when he agreed to take asylum seekers to Australia, he was still unfamiliar with the Australian law on people smuggling. But of course it had crossed his mind that something might be wrong with the amount of money that he was offered for something which was only a couple of days' work, as he thought at first. So he was suspicious, but still it looked like a good opportunity to him. What I found most striking when talking to him is that when he talked about his jail term in Australia, which was almost 3 years, at that first time, he talked about it in terms of work. So it was not a punishment, but it was a way of making a living, just as precarious or as risky as many other options that were available to him. So in jail, he could do some manual labor, like work as a gardener or work in the kitchen, and he would be given something between $20 and $65 a week, which sounds like nothing for us, but given to his weekly incomes back home, back on Rote, this was actually quite a substantial income. So over the years, he managed to accumulate some of this money, took it back with him, and managed to build a house a house made out of concrete. So in this regard, jail time in Australia was not a disincentive. So when for a second time the opportunity for him arose that he might be taking people to Australia, he consulted his wife, explained to her that he will be absent for probably 3 years or even more. She gave her blessings, and off he went. When I asked him about the possibility to end up in an Indonesian jail, however, he said, like, under no circumstances would he then be prepared to become involved in people smuggling, because the conditions in Indonesian jails are a lot worse. I have talked a little bit about these fishermen who are nowadays no longer able to live from the fishing, and one of the reasons, as I found out when visiting Rote, is that as you can see on this map, these reefs where the people used to fish in the past are actually Australian territory, and Australia, for the sake of environmental or conservation of nature, has declared these zones as a no-go area. So Indonesian fishermen, even though for hundreds of years they have been going there to collect sea cucumber and other marine products, can now only fish in this very small box, but they're not allowed to bring any modern equipment, they're not allowed to bring a GPS or motorized boat, which makes it of course very difficult for them. If you're drifting, if you're sailing at the sea, you might be easily taken away by the currents or by the wind. You end up in the wrong area at the sea, and that means you might actually be arrested for illegal fishing. And when talking to these people from Rotte, I discovered there was often quite a long story that people shared before they become involved in people smuggling. So I met a guy, he had been 13 times to Australia and 13 times to jail. The first 12 times he was arrested for illegal fishing. So Australian customs came, arrested him, confiscated the boat and the catch, burned that, put him in jail. And then he was sent back to Indonesia after a while, where he was facing an enormous amount of debts. The boat didn't belong to him, he had to repay these debts, and since there was very little work available to him to pay off the debts, he of course was tempted to then take up whatever came up. So he was involved in illegal fishing, and he was also later on involved in taking asylum seekers to Australia, because it seemed as one possibility to get out of this debt spiral. The second thing, which is probably worth mentioning, at least for the part that I visited in eastern Indonesia, where I saw so many fishermen being recruited into people smuggling, and when I say a lot, I'm talking about between 1,000 and 2,000 Indonesian fishermen who had been put in Australian jails. The numbers in Indonesia were a lot smaller, but so I find it's quite substantial. So the second reason why people, particularly from this area, were so vulnerable to the recruitment of people smugglers was that because making a living from fishing had become more and more difficult, already in the 90s people started to invest into seaweed farming. So they had been provided with seeds, they started planting seaweed, harvested that, dried it, sold it off. So this was hoped to be one way out of poverty, seaweed cultivation. However, in 2009, there was a terrible oil spill in the Timor Sea that caused severe ecological damage and inflicted economic difficulties on the Rottenese seaweed farmers, but also on the fishermen. It's not entirely, it's not known what the exact amount of oil that spilled into the sea was, but it's estimated that between 400 to 2,000 barrels of oil per day flowed into the sea for almost 70 days. So the oil rig company is operated by an Australian oil company in Perth. And the economic loss to fishing and seaweed in this particular province amounts to approximately 1.5 billion per year since 2009. However, these people have never seen a single cent of compensation, and the Australian Lawyers Alliance did a number of community consultations and published a report, and we can see that there's actually quite an increase of people from this area becoming involved in people smuggling after 2009, because they were desperate enough to do so. I think I stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.